Hi, I'm Josh Katzenstein. This is Jeff Duncan, and this is this week's version of Dat Chat Live. Welcome everyone on Facebook, and you can feel free to send all of your questions. We'll be talking about the NFL draft and what the Saints might do. Obviously, we have no idea. I don't think they have any idea, but we can certainly pontificate and pretend to know. So like I said, send any questions, and we will start firing it up.
Doesn't have to be about draft either. It could be about anything.
Yeah, you can ask anything, although
including about his glasses.
One thing you can't ask, and I can't stress this enough, is about Dez Bryant. We will not be accepting any question about Dez Bryant. We've gone through that exhaustively, and that's it.
Wow. Anti-Dez. Well,
no, it's not an anti-Dez.
I'll accept any Dez questions.
It's an anti-Dez question stance. But Jeff, there have been some, reports about who's been visiting the Saints on so every team gets 30 official pre-draft visits where they host the players at their team facility, and they can ask them questions and sort of pick their brains a little bit more than they would have at the Combine or the Senior Bowl or whatever. But then the Saints also, they go to different schools,
right,
and they do workouts there beyond what's going on at the pro days. So, there's no shortage of opportunities for them to sort of figure out what's going on. But basically what I've seen is a lot of receivers and linebackers are among the spots that they seem to be researching the most.
That makes sense, right?
Yeah, do you feel like those are their two biggest needs? It's really hard to tell what exactly their needs are because they did, a pretty good job filling those in free agency.
Well, I think they'll take a receiver in the draft at some point. They've done well in the past finding those kind of mid-round draft picks like Kenny Stills. Is the guy that stands out to me. It was like a fifth-round pick, fourth-round pick, ends up being a starting receiver. I think the Saints feel so good about their offense, they can really find a guy that will be productive for them at receiver in a bunch of different levels of the draft. I know Mike Thomas was a high second-round pick and has turned out to be a number one receiver, but I think the Saints system, it's less imperative that you get just an all-around dominant receiver is maybe a role player, at least as long as you have Mike Thomas on board. You know me, I'm not big on linebackers, but I do think there is a need for some young depth there. I think their starting unit's intact, so I think they're probably in search of good quality depth anywhere on the team, including offensive line, which seems like something you've talked about before. They're going to need to think down the road.
Yeah.
By the offensive line, especially with Armstead getting older, starting to break down injury-wise. They've already lost Max Unger. Larry Warford, how much longer do you keep him, with that contract? There's a lot of things to think about on the offensive line.
So I think offensive line could sneakily be the biggest need for them. If you just think – so basically the way you have to look at this draft is that it's strictly building for the long term. And typically that's the way most teams approach a draft anyway, but I think the draft – and I'm gonna write about this here in the next few days. The 2017 draft really reset expectations for fans about what a rookie class can do. And as good as that draft was, it's a little bit sort of it did a little bit of a disservice to fans because now they expect every rookie to come in and be productive. And then obviously last year that would have meant, if you had that mindset, that the class was disappointing because really you only got production out of Marcus Davenport and a little bit from Traquan Smith, and then the rest of the guys aren't on the team anymore.
Right.
And I feel like people need to be prepared for it to be something similar this year because they only have one pick in the first 4 rounds, and a second-round pick certainly could play a role this upcoming season. But if you look at the Saints roster, it's going to be hard for anyone to really crack the lineup. I wouldn't expect any rookie to come in and be a starter right away at any position, but I think obviously they could come in and be a backup and then hopefully a starter down the road. And when you look at the offensive line, Andrus Pete's in the last year of his deal, and depending on how well he plays this year, he could get a really, really big deal next year because, obviously he's pretty good at guard and he has versatility to play tackle. He has versatility to play left tackle. He's not as good at left tackle, but, there's a lot of teams are having problems finding offensive tackles right now, so someone might pay him a lot of money. And then, so if he's in the last year of his deal, and we look at what happened with Max Unger retiring, the Saints clearly weren't confident enough in Cameron Tom or Will Clapp to immediately fill into that center role. So I don't know what's going to happen between now and next year that they would suddenly feel comfortable with one of those two guys starting at left guard if Andres Pete were to leave. You talked about Armstead. Obviously he's dealt with injuries, and they haven't signed Jermon Bushrod back, so they really don't have a top backup option at tackle. So I think, certainly offensive line, if we're looking for somebody that would help in 2020 as opposed to 2019, I think the offensive line might be the top spot.
Yeah, because Warford's under contract through 2020.
Yep.
Beyond that, you don't know what you're going to get, right?
Right.
So I think it makes a lot of sense to me. I think we've talked about it before. I think they could use an edge rusher, an extra edge rusher. We know they were interested in Robert Quinn. They looked at Ziggy Ansah. Neither one of those materialized in free agency. They signed a couple of defensive tackles to improve the defensive line in free agency, bolster that area until Onyemata and Rankins come back, assuming they do come back at what they were before. But edge rushers, pretty much three guys right now: Cam Jordan, Marcus Davenport, and Trey Hendrickson.
Right.
So they could use some competition there, I think. And I think if there's one there, like just a specialist in the second round, sometimes those guys are available in the second round. They're just kind of third down rushers because they're just a role player. They drop to the second round. That would be a viable guy for this team because I think they feel like Davenport's going to be a long-term, every down starter kind of player. And Hendrickson maybe not so much. So who knows what they do. They can go in a number of directions. I think the only thing they won't draft is a kicker or punter. I think I can safely say maybe not a long snapper.
Never know. Maybe they just want to. Maybe Saints fans are going to be so bored during the draft that the Saints will just throw them a curveball to make sure they're awake.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's the only reason.
What do you think about this, though? Somebody brought this up, and I think there's a really legitimate possibility of this, them trading down in the second round. I think that is a realistic possibility because the way this draft shapes up, the second round that grade of player goes pretty deep, and because they lack picks, they only have one in the first 2 days. Maybe they pick up a second day 2 pick.
So they trade down from the second round and get like 2 third-round picks?
Yeah, maybe something like that. Just to pick up an extra pick or maybe a fourth rounder if they don't have.
I could see that.
I
mean, they can't really trade down in the second round because they already had 2 spots behind them.
But maybe somebody wants a player really badly late in the second round that they really value. The Saints are, I think, a catbird seat as far as their roster to where they can afford trade down. Let's pick up an extra pick because what they're basically doing right here is trying to build depth, I think, on this team long term, so they can get a developmental prospect that comes in at a number of positions to get 2 of those guys, like the positions we're talking about. Then I can see them doing that because they're not going to get an impact talent where they're at in the second round.
Well, not a year one impact.
Right. It's just not. I mean,
maybe
it can happen.
Actually, no. So here's the only 2 positions I think that they would get any impact is either a wide receiver or a running back. I think everyone knows about the need for a wide receiver, but I think a lot of people are sort of sleeping on the idea that they need a running back because they brought in Latavius Murray. But if you think about the way Sean Payton has run his offense, since he's been here in 2006, it's very rarely been a 2-headed monster. I mean, what we've seen with Mark Ingram and Alvin Kamara the past 2 years was really sort of a change in philosophy for Sean Payton. I mean, he normally uses 3 or 4 running backs and mixes them in at different times. So I think if you don't believe that Latavius Murray is as good as Mark Ingram was, then that would, in theory, leave some openings and some opportunities for a third running back to have some playing time. And I think that, it might not be in the second round, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if they draft a running back and maybe somebody, who can be a receiver out of the backfield, because I don't think Latavius Murray can do that as well as Mark Ingram. So it wouldn't be, the huge impact necessarily, but I think certainly there's a chance for somebody to carve out a role at that spot.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. One thing I've learned about covering Sean Payton over the years, and Mickey Loomis to some degree, is they like to be counterintuitive. They like to zig when the rest of the league zags. The Patriots are a lot like that. Them taking a running back in the second round would be that example. And it would make sense because everybody else is devaluing running backs in this day and age, and the Saints might say, you know what, we're going to take the best player, and the best player is a running back. That would make a lot of sense to me. And you're right, that guy would probably be an impact player for this team coming in next year. And they're not tied up financially that drastically with Latavius Murray. to where it would, to me, that would be a very smart move, and I could see something like that, especially if you got a guy, and I think that's what they would take, is a player that would be complementary in some way with a different kind of player than, say, Alvin Kamara.
So someone I like a lot is D'Angelo Henderson from Memphis, and I think he's the kind of guy who will probably be a second-round pick. And if he were to fall to them, and I know the Saints met with him, I believe it was at Memphis's pro day. So I think, if a guy like that's available, who's speedy but can also have some receiving potential, because I think really what the Saints need on offense is just one more playmaker. It doesn't really matter what position.
That's a great point.
I think we look at the Saints. I mean, they sort of mold their offense around whoever is the most lethal threat. I mean, everyone's like, oh my God, they need a tight end. Like, the offense was at its best with Jimmy Graham. Last year, the offense was amazing for the first 2/3 of the season, even though they're getting very little production from the tight end position. So I think, even though wide receiver might seem like a big need, I think if you're the Saints, you know that right now your top 3 offensive playmakers are going to be Alvin Kamara, Michael Thomas, and Jared Cook. So then beyond that, I don't think it matters whether it's a receiver or a running back or even another tight end, although I feel like tight ends very rarely are productive as rookies. So I think, it could go any number of ways. And especially, like, people really seem to be forgetting that Cameron Meredith could end up being good in this offense. If he's healthy and he can revert back to what he was for the Bears, all of a sudden, a rookie wide receiver isn't going to have much of an opportunity. So
And Des Bryant's still out there, too.
So Eric Thomas, I was just going to leave that one there. Eric Thomas from Facebook asked, just for fun, predict the Saints' Week 1 opponent. What do you think?
Well, that's a good question. Man, we got a 1 in 16 chance, actually, or less than that.
No,
better than that.
1 in 12?
Yeah,
1 in 13? 1 in 12.
Yeah, we got a better chance. So I would say it's going to be, I think they're going on the road to start the season. I don't know why, but I feel like that's so.
You know why? To anger all the fans out there.
Yeah, there's a conspiracy.
One of my biggest pet peeves in this job is people complaining about the schedule, because they're always like,
"Hello, we got 15 minutes in before he went on a rant. 15 minutes, and you're not even old yet. You're getting ready to get old."
I can't believe we started the show with me wearing those glasses and you not saying anything about my birthday coming up on Sunday.
Your birthday is Sunday?
Now I have to bring it up and look like
one?
some self-centered jerk.
What do you mean look like? What do you mean look like?
Good point.
All right,
so wait, back to my pet peeve. Fans always...
This is a soapbox ad.
No. Do you want me to stand? I don't know if the camera's tall enough.
No.
It's probably tall enough for you, though.
Come on, that was not that
Sorry,
funny.
that was too easy. But no, everyone complains. There's like, oh my God, they have 3 games on the road in a row. They, aren't going to be home till such and such. But it all evens out. I mean, I think last year there was, people complaining that the Saints were like on the road too much at the beginning of the season, but then they had a bunch of home games at the end, so it all evens out. But I would say Week 1 prediction.
Well, we know it's not going to be the Bears.
Not going to be the Bears.
Because they're locked in to play the Packers in Week 1.
Could it be the Rams?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Rams would be a little... It's not going to be a marquee game, I don't think.
I don't think the NFL wants to bring attention to that right away at the beginning of the...
And I don't think it'll be a marquee game because the marquee games are already set. We know the Patriots are going to play the kickoff game, right? And then they're also going to have the Bears-Packers. Mm-hmm. So they're not going to load up Saints-Rams in that same weekend. They're going to save that for another weekend. So I would say it could be somebody like... Seattle. I think Seattle would be an interesting opponent.
I think that would be a marquee game, but I'm going to go with the 49ers at home. Because I think all of a sudden you have the elder statesman QB against the young hotshot Jimmy G. You got a young up-and-coming team, that people seem to think is going to be good. Young offensive mind and Kyle Shanahan going. Yeah, I think that
it's going to be a great game.
I think that would be a good game, and I think it would create enough of a stir to start out the year.
And I think the 49ers are one of those teams. Obviously, they lost Garoppolo last year. They could be a team that bounces back and makes the playoffs this year. I mean, they're one of those teams people forget about. If you're a Vegas gambler, I think they'd be a good over bet on whatever their win total is, because I think they could bounce. I think they've got good front office management. I like Lynch a lot, and I think Shanahan's a very cagey coach. You get a good quarterback, you bolster the rest of that team. Obviously, losing Reuben Foster was a big blow for them. Yeah, they had a huge investment, but I like the direction they're going as an organization. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Here's what I think, and look, I may be reading way too much into this, Saints are at home in their final preseason game. If you're ever going to send them out to Seattle or the West Coast, that's an easy time to do it. Opening game, you've been at home, you're not in the rigors of the full season. It's easy to take your opening weekend and make a West Coast trip.
Yeah, but Jeff, you're forgetting that the NFL hates the Saints.
Well, that's true. I did forget about that. So, okay, moving on.
Matt Faust from Facebook asked, what do you think about UMass wide receiver Andy Isabella in the second round?
I'll defer to you on that because I have no idea about it.
So I think that would be a great pick for the Saints. I don't know. I actually have no sense of where Isabella might go. I mean, to me, everything about him screams second round pick. But I think, some people are worried that it might be a little short. I mean, I think some people are sort of pigeonholing him as this stereotypical
white guy, possession
receiver.
White
slot receiver. But dude, he's so fast. And I think he's exactly. Let me pull up his numbers because I think he's exactly the kind of receiver the Saints could use because he has the quickness and size in theory to work out of the slot, but he also has the speed to be a deep threat. And I think that's sort of what the Saints would want long term. I mean, I think they definitely need a deep threat eventually to replace Ted Ginn, and it might be Traquan Smith, but he certainly didn't prove that was a role that he could thrive in last year when Ginn was hurt. So let's see. Andy Isabella, 5'9", 188, 4'3", 140. So
that's
and then
impressive.
a 4.15 shuttle, and a 6.95 3-cone. So I mean, I definitely think that this is a guy who would make a lot of sense in the Saints offense. I mean, really, this is a weird comparison, but he could basically just be a rich man's Tommy Lee Lewis. I mean, Tommy Lee Lewis was a guy that they had. They kept trying to work him in because they wanted to utilize that speed, but he just couldn't really thrive as a returner or as a receiver. I mean, they gave him the ball on handoff sometimes, but I think Andy Isabella, if they drafted him, I definitely would be giving that grade a thumbs up.
Yeah, and I think he in some ways fits the exact same mold of what you're talking about with D'Angelo Henderson. That is, kind of a speedy threat, can be used in a bunch of different ways. And I think it's a good way to look at that second round pick and what the Saints might do is just think playmakers, don't worry about positions, think about another element that's added to the Saints offense, whether that's a tight end that they think could be a difference maker and as a role player, whether it's a receiver, could be a running back. I think Sean Payton is going to tailor their offense to whatever personnel they have, and it could be a number of different positions there, but I think he would love to add somebody else to that offense that takes them to the next level in this offseason.
But at the same time, if we're talking about taking it to the next level, I'm just going to keep bringing it back to this. Offensive line, they're going to need somebody for that sixth offensive line spot. They like to do that a lot. So as much as the Saints probably want to get faster on offense, I think they also need to, try to it wouldn't surprise me if they also tried to get a little more powerful because, Bushrod was doing that a lot last year. I'm sure Cameron Tom could probably do it, but they, if they drafted an offensive line with that second round pick, I wouldn't be surprised if that guy actually does make an impact just because he'll be playing as that extra, lineman on those run packages or those heavy packages.
And, you made a great point about the lack of tackles in the league. And the more we read about that, the more it reinforces the picks that they made the last few years when they took Ramczyk at the end of the first round in 2015, and then they took, 2017, and then they took Andres Pete, who was there. They really weren't targeting Andres Pete at all. I think they had other guys they wanted more, but the board didn't fall their way. They couldn't make a move. So they ended up taking a good young tackle, and while he hasn't turned out to be a tackle, he's turned out to be a versatile offensive lineman for them. Those decisions have been very smart because it's allowed this offense to have some stability up front. And Zach Strief always told me, and he's right, the best Saints offense are always when they have the best line. Everybody focuses on the perimeter players because they get all the glory and they score the touchdowns. But he says, if you look back, our best offenses statistically have always been when we've had our best lines. And he's right. That's what happened last year. Even though they didn't end up ranked as high, that was a very productive, efficient offense.
And I think speed is often overrated for NFL players because if you look at, look at the Patriots. I can't name a single fast player on the Patriots the past few years.
Right.
You know,
Well, you also
I guess they had Brandon Cooks, but then they traded Brandon Cooks. You know, I guess
Right.
Chris Hogan's kind of fast, but like ultimately, I don't think speed is the most important thing. I mean, look at Michael Thomas. He's not one of the fastest receivers at all, but I mean, he still beats people because you can win with power or savvy or whatever.
Technique.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of ways to win.
Right. And here's another way that Mark Kohler wants to know about. He asks, are we going to draft a tall wide receiver for red zone needs? I don't really think that's an issue.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think they're going to be better in some ways by having Jared Cook there.
Mm-hmm.
I think Jared Cook's a very, solid player. I think he's an upgrade tight end. But they didn't have very many trouble scoring in the red zone,
Right.
I feel like, last year. They used Kamara a lot down
Mm-hmm.
there. He scored a lot of touchdowns on those little swing passes. I think that's one of the most underrated aspects of Sean Payton as an offensive play caller. I mean, they would use a fullback, Zach Line, he'd score. I mean, they had a number of ways of scoring. So I don't think they get caught up too much in that, like the old Jimmy Graham days of the jump
Right.
ball.
Yeah, I don't think, I think people try to pigeonhole these, needs, for physicality or body type or athleticism. But I mean, I think, Michael Thomas, again, not the tallest receiver, but I certainly trust throwing it to him in the red zone more than just about anyone in the NFL. Alvin Kamara can power through. Jared Cook is a big guy. So I don't know that specifically is a need, but, like we were saying earlier, there's really not any pick that would surprise me. So if you think they need a receiver, I would, I think we agree that, a slot guy would make some sense, but at the same time, if they took a big-bodied outside guy, I think that guy could, carve out a role. If they took a speed threat, I think that guy could carve out a role. So I don't think that's necessarily a need, but, if they took it, Here, how about this? If they take a tall receiver, he could help them, but I still don't think you're going to see them throwing it up to some rookie receiver in the red zone more so than throwing it to Mike Thomas, Jared Cook, or Alvin Kamara.
Well, they got some pretty good size at receiver anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, Kirkwood's got good size. Obviously, Thomas, 6'2".
Meredith.
Yeah, Meredith's got good size. Even Traquan Smith's a fairly big, decent-sized receiver. So, I mean, maybe, but I don't think that's a huge need to answer your question.
Another one from Eric Thomas. Do you see any other free agents being signed? Ansa or someone else? Or are we pretty much done?
No, I don't think they're done, but I think Ansa, I mean, they must not have liked what they saw from his shoulder.
So pretty much every team, from my understanding, is sort of waiting for him to recover a little bit more. They brought him in. I think the Bills brought him in. So I think, it's sort of like a Des Bryant situation where you just got to wait until they're healthy before you make a decision.
But he could end up being one of these great finds, you know. I mean, great signings late. His market's going to have gone down, and I think he would fit great on this roster. I think he would be a perfect fit. You covered him. I mean, he's got big-time ability. He's had a lot of injuries.
Right.
And so, I mean, if you get – and they've had success doing this in the past. I mean, we know we did it with Nick Fairley, guy, and the Patriots kind of follow that model. They take highly rated players from past drafts that for whatever reason have washed out, and then they sign them at a low price tag, and they get something out of them. They don't usually sign them very long, maybe 1 or 2 years. I could see Ziggy Ansah being that role for the Saints.
Kyle Van Noy, perfect example. I mean, he became a
Josh
stud
Gordon
for the Patriots, the past couple of years after, barely doing anything for the Lions. They got Michael Bennett, for a 5th-round pick this year. I mean, obviously the Patriots are the masters. But no, the Saints aren't done. I mean, they're going to sign some guys. I don't know if they'll sign anyone else before the draft. I think, look, a couple years ago, they signed Adrian Peterson before the draft just because they weren't sure they were going to get a running back that they wanted. And then you end up getting Alvin Kamara. So,
that's a good point.
It might not be until before the draft, but then I think after the draft, you'll see, they'll probably sign somebody after re-examining their roster. I mean, a few of their own free agents are still available. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if Jermon Bushrod wants to play, maybe he could come back, or Josh Laribis, if he wants to play, maybe he could come back. I mean, I think, there's certainly some older guys, but I don't think it's going to be anyone that moves the needle, especially because the Saints barely have any cap space left. They're at like $8.5 million, and most of that money is going to end up going to their rookie class.
And I don't think they'd do anything at this point, Eric, until after the draft, like Josh said. Now they're pretty much focused on the draft for the next few weeks. they'll set the roster after the draft, look at it, see where they might feel like they're a little thin or might need some depth, and they'll go out and plug those holes. But right now, they're just buried in draft meetings, and I'm sure Terry Fontenot and his staff still have a ready list, but they're probably also involved in those draft meetings as well.
Right, and some of these guys that they might be interested in will probably come in for rookie minicamp and have an opportunity to try out for the roster. So, I mean, I know this is cliche that Mickey Loomis and other executives like to say, but the roster is always fluid, so there's going to keep being changes. But like I said, at this point, there really isn't anyone out there I think that would move the needle among the fan base. Jamie Horton asked sort of what we're talking about. What about another defensive end, either through the draft or through free agency?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think it would be through the draft.
Yeah.
I don't think free agency at this point. What are you getting?
Ansah.
Unless Ansah. That's the only one I think. I mean, I've looked out there. There's not a whole lot left.
Right.
It was a pretty weak free agency class in general. There was some quality at the top this year randomly, but for the most part, you're not going to get anybody, I think, that's going to come in and be any more of a contributor than, say, Trey Hendrickson is already.
Well, so what do you think about Trey Hendrickson? I think this is a guy that, to me, he has a lot of untapped potential, but I don't know if he's ever going to have the chance to show it.
Yeah, I mean, he's had some injury issues, right? I mean, he seems like a guy that we all know he's that kind of, and I don't want to pigeonhole him or stereotype him, but he's one of these grinder types, high motor, can slide inside, and I think he's a productive player, but he's never going to, I think, be a starter at this league. I think they've got Marcus Davenport targeted for that. But I know that Sean Payton's always been high on him and is always, if you notice, and we've covered Payton a lot, you can kind of read between the lines sometimes with Sean Payton when he talks. He will unsolicited bring up Trey Hendrickson. He does that a lot. When you see that with a player, when he brings him up, that means they like him, generally. And he does that with Trey Hendrickson a lot. So I don't think they're ready to give up on him. I think he's still definitely going to be a part of their future. But, I think they would also – you can never have enough of these good players. And look how many Saints defensive linemen they've lost to injuries the last few years. I mean, that's a tough position. Those guys tend to get banged up. So
that's what I was going to say. I mean, I think that actually might be a position where they need depth more than anywhere else on the roster. I mean, if you say those are your three guys, and then maybe you have Mario Edwards who can slide outside, but I think they're sort of eyeing him as more of an interior player. I mean, all of a sudden, if Marcus Davenport gets hurt like he did last year, then either Trey Hendrickson or a rookie is starting, and I mean that just crushes you. So I think I would expect them to probably draft an edge rusher at some point, but again, unless it's that second round pick, that guy might not even make the team, and then they'll probably sign someone. And it might be like a Paul Kruger situation a couple years ago where they just wait until right before the season and pick from another team's scraps.
Were you surprised, or maybe not surprised, but I was kind of interested in the fact that Jaron Elliott had such a good year in the AAF, and he's a guy that played well last training camp, is a good pass rusher. I think we all agree on that. I think he led the Saints in sacks in preseason last year. That they didn't maybe look to bring him back. He must not be a good scheme fit for them or something. There's a reason.
I don't think he's a great scheme fit for them. I think he's more of a 3-4 sort of outside linebacker. But at the same time, I mean, he looked pretty good when he was playing for the Saints in the preseason. And I feel like he's played in a 4-3 before. So I think probably one of the issues is that he felt slighted, and this is all just speculation. But I imagine he felt slighted because he probably thought that he deserved to make the team last year. So when he was getting offers, and I don't know if the Saints ever called him after what he showed in the AAF, but I would think that he probably wants to go somewhere else where he hasn't been
cast.
Yeah, right, exactly.
He's 6'3", 255. You're right. He's kind of a classic build of a outside linebacker in a 3-4 scheme.
And I think for the Saints more so than other teams, the Saints really want their defensive ends to be good against the run. Mm-hmm. And I think a guy that size, they would worry, because, I mean, let's think about who's the last Saints situational pass rusher?
Yeah, they haven't had very many of those.
I mean, that's just not the way they do things under Dennis Allen. Marcus Davenport is huge, and they got him because, and he was better against the run than I expected as a rookie.
Yeah.
Trey Hendrickson's a big guy. Alex Okafor is a big guy. I think the Saints don't mind sort of sacrificing a little pass rush as long as their edge rushers can defend the run. And obviously it helped them a lot last year when they were the number 2 run defense in the NFL. So I
just was curious about that because this is a guy that can rush the passer. He's a good dude. We dealt with him. He's not like a locker room issue at all. He was popular in the locker room. He had, those guys all got along. And he's obviously productive. Yeah. That one thing he does, I think he's good at, and that's something I think the Saints could use. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of surprising to see him move on elsewhere after his good offseason.
All right. Mark Kohler says, how about expanding Taysom's role? And that is a question for Jeff.
Oh, yeah. I'm the Taysom Hill beat writer. I've been unofficially deemed that. Actually, officially, probably.
It's official.
Yeah, it's official. What do you mean expand his role? I mean, his role's pretty expansive right now. He's playing receiver, backup quarterback, fullback.
I think people just want to be able to draft him in fantasy.
Right. Well, I don't
pretty unreliable week-to-week fantasy player.
No, I think what'll be interesting from Taysom Hill's perspective is what do they do now that everybody's had a full offseason to evaluate the Saints' RPO game with him, and how do the Saints adapt? Can they adapt and advance this beyond? Because it kind of lost its steam about mid-season, to be honest with you. I mean, people started, more film they got on them, the less effective that thing was. And I think Taysom Hill needs to be a little better at it. He wasn't the greatest at reading.
So that's what I was waiting to say. I mean, the elephant in the room here, I don't know. So teams may have figured out their RPO, but I think, if anything, it was that Taysom, too often chose wrong.
So Taysom hater.
Dude, you were teeing that one up because you agree with me, and I think Sean Payton certainly agrees with us. I mean, there were some times where either he handed it off or kept it, and he should have done the opposite.
It's a hard thing to do.
Could have created a big play.
No, it's hard. Very hard to do. I mean, it's easy for us on the press box.
You're giving excuses for, your boy Taysom. But no, I think that, I agree that some teams are going to study this and may have a plan, but the plan might not work. I mean, because the Saints could get better at it too with another offseason to work. So I don't know how much they're going to expand it. I do think, that, he had a pretty sizable role. I mean, he was playing like 15% of the snaps. I mean, as a third-round quarterback, plus playing all of the special team snaps. I mean, I just don't know how much more, they could put on his plate, especially at the risk of taking away from Drew Brees.
Taysom Hill is the perfect example of what we've been talking about throughout this podcast, and that is, here's a player that Sean Payton looked at and said, this is an athlete, let's use him in our offense. And they created a role for an athlete, a playmaker, and got something out of him. I mean, this is a guy people weren't even thinking about. He wasn't even in their draft plans. They got him through undrafted free agency, and they get an athlete in the building, and he carves out a role and gets something out of him. And you have to give him a lot of credit for that. That's exactly how you should think of the Saints' offensive skill position players when you look at a draft. Don't worry so much about the positions. Worry about the talent level and how they can fit him in, because Sean Payton will find a way to utilize him. It might be this Jace Sternberger, tight end from Texas A&M. He's a lot like Dan Arnold. He's kind of not a great blocker, but he does a couple things really, really well. He might take a guy like that, and all of a sudden that guy might score 8 or 9 touchdowns next year, and no one's even thinking about him because Sean Payton has a vision with how he would fit in their offense. I think that's the way to think about Saints' offensive skill position players.
I think that would be a reach in the second round, but if they trade back into the third round, it might make some sense, especially because when you think about it, I think Jared Cook only has guaranteed money for this year. So as much as we're saying, that they've addressed their tight end need, again, by 2020, they're going to potentially need another tight end. Eben Bryce says, what about Sue?
No, back to Ndamukong Suh. I think they are done at defensive tackle.
I agree.
Malcolm Brown was a pretty significant signing. I mean, he's signed to start. He's going to start no matter what with that money. And then they went out and got Mario Edwards to kind of fill in. I think he's going to be the role player guy, the third guy in there. And then they're going to, whenever Onyemata and Rankins come back, they're going to have 4 defensive tackles. They also got Stallworth, who I think is a pretty good player. I mean, I think that guy's got ability. I think they're set at defensive tackle. So I would be stunned if they brought in Sue. It's kind of excess at this point.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, obviously, he's definitely the best free agent out there, but he's already 32, which seems crazy for me to think about. But they actually, on Sportsline, have odds for Sue. The Seahawks are the favorites at 3-1. The Saints are 11th at 20-1. And I just don't think, it makes a lot of sense. Like Jeff was saying, they've addressed the defensive tackle need. So even if they are looking for talent, I just don't see, how that would work out for them. Derek Washington says, I wish the Saints would stop trading up in the draft, trade back, and get more picks. Jeff mentioned that earlier. And I agree in theory that you want, as many chances to hit on players as possible. But at the same time, I don't know how many of the draft picks are going to make the roster this year. I mean, if you look at what happened last year, it was really only 2 players from their draft class that made it. Everyone from day 3 got cut. And, I don't think the roster or the depth chart has gotten much worse. So, if you're bringing in, if you trade that second-round pick to get like 3/4 or something, I don't know that all 3 of those players are going to make the roster. So, I mean, even though I like that idea in theory, I just don't know if it would work out in the Saints' favor.
Yeah, I mean, look at the year. We were talking about it yesterday in one of our draft meetings. 2000, I had the wrong year, actually, which is not shocking the way I've been going lately. 2012, they didn't have a first-round pick that year. Akeem Hicks was the draft pick in the 3rd round. We all know has turned out to be a terrific player. And then they got Nick Toon in the 4th round, Corey White, who kind of bounced around as a backup, defensive back in the league for a few years. In the 5th round, Andrew Tiller, who I think also kind of bounced around as a backup in the league, but only really one significant player in that entire class, and that was Akeem Hicks, and he didn't really play much for the Saints beyond the 2nd or 3rd season. So I think we're looking at that kind of draft. Mm-hmm. Again, maybe one player that does something, and then the rest are going to be guys that just kind of, you hope you find a diamond in the rough or something.
Right, yeah, sorry to Will Clapp. I forgot that he did make the roster. But, I mean, you look, Rick Leonard, 4th-round pick last year, didn't make it. Natrell Jamerson, 5th-round pick, didn't make it. Cameron Moore, 6th-round pick, didn't make it. And Boston Scott, 6th-round pick, didn't make it. He ended up on the practice squad and then went to play for the Eagles at the end of the year. But I think, it's going to be tough for anyone to make the roster. It's going to be even tougher for anyone to make an impact. So I don't know if trading down, for a bunch more picks is going to be in the Saints' best interest.
They're very good at finding these small school guys. I mean, a lot of teams put a lot of emphasis on that. And I think this could be one of those drafts where they take a guy. I mean, that's what Akeem Hicks basically was. Mm-hmm. That fell, even though he had the talent. Onyemata is kind of like that. You take a guy that could be a developmental player, and you hope in 3 years he ends up being worth a 2nd-round pick instead of a 4th-rounder.
Right, and one thing that I would say is, the Saints do a really good job with undrafted free agents. So I think, one reason to think that they wouldn't trade down is this is supposed to be a really deep draft. Mm-hmm. So I think they're probably feeling pretty confident that, even though they're lacking, high picks, that they'll be able to find, 1 or 2 players that, will compete for a roster spot among the undrafted players. And that's why they do so much research on all these small school guys, because if any of them slip through the cracks, then, they already have this relationship with these players so that when they call them, to sign them as undrafted guys, that they're more inclined to come here. So that's another reason why I think trading down might not be in their best interest, just because, if you're acquiring a bunch of 4th and 5th round picks, then those guys are going to be competing for the undrafted guys that you were going to get anyway. So
yeah, if you feel really good about your ability to recruit undrafted guys, I think the Saints do. Sean Payton's really good at that. They have a bunch of guys on their staff that are good at that. This is a place where maybe you could sell a certain position on coming in and, hey, you got a shot as much as anybody, especially at running back, right? So,
yeah. I don't know if you want to take this this other one, or we can skip to the last one.
What's that? I haven't seen it yet. I'm sorry. I was looking at something else.
It's all good.
Great.
We appreciate our editor, Jennifer, sending us all of our questions
Eric
from Facebook.
Eric asked about the NOLA no call as a potential book deal. I don't know if there's enough material there for a book, but there is a book on the horizon.
Could you imagine writing that book and just having to relive that? I feel like I've been reliving it every day since it happened. and then just having to dive even deeper and making everyone else relive it?
No. But I will say this, I guess we can announce here on Facebook Live that I do have a book in the works that's just kind of happened the last week or so. It's going to be on Drew Brees and Sean Payton. So the NOLA No Call will be part of that book, no question, because it's a big chapter in their legacy that could propel them. Who knows? Maybe that's what propels them onto a title, much the way the Virginia Cavaliers had adversity in 1 year and then a year later became champions. Sounds like a good book title.
It's a little different. The Rams weren't quite a 16 seed from, what was it, Maryland,
Just roll with it,
Baltimore. All right, let's roll with it. Last question from Robert Lofton. Do we have anyone to trade in order to trade up to the first round?
No.
I don't think so.
No. I mean, Andres Pete would be the only tradable asset I could think of.
Yeah.
And he's not worth that.
No, he's not worth that. And I think, if you're like, what would you be trading Andres Pete for? To get left guard? Like, I mean, it's
right.
Because once you lose Pete, then all of a sudden, you're making the offensive line worse. So
I think I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I guess one tradable asset, maybe Eli Apple if they're not sold on him. But I mean, I think they just traded for him last year.
4th rounder, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think he's probably worth a little bit more than a 4th rounder right now. But I just don't know that they have anyone that could net them a 1st round pick.
Peter King's column this week had a great anecdote in there, or phrase from Mike Lombardi, former NFL executive, former general manager of the Browns, who said that 1st round picks are like cars on a car lot. As soon as you buy it and put any amount of wear on it, it loses its value quickly. They diminish and decrease in value very quickly. So a guy like Josh Rosen's what the reference was to. Mm-hmm. The guy was a 1st round draft pick, right? I mean, but now in a trade, he's liable to get a 3rd round pick in return at best. So even though Andres Pete was a 1st rounder and started, he's not worth anything close to that. So I think the value in trading a player like that, especially as we get close to the draft, diminishes greatly. So I can't see them having the ammo to trade up.
Well, Eli Apple's a perfect example of that. 2 years after he's drafted, he's a 4th round pick. And even Brandon Cooks, who was exceptional and incredibly productive for his first 2 years, the Saints netted a 1st round pick for him.
That was an amazing trade.
But it was a much later. I mean, it was 20 it was like 15 spots later, and then the Rams ended up giving up the same thing to the Patriots. So, but I think that's pretty rare. And we're talking about a guy who was one of the leading receivers in the NFL, and it still wasn't more valuable.
What did Antonio Brown fetch?
Wasn't it a 3rd round pick?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
But that's all sort of salary stuff. Either way, the answer is no. Perhaps the Saints, would package. If the Saints are trying to get up to the 1st round, they would have to package their 2nd round pick this year and probably a future 1st round pick, and maybe even more because a lot of people probably don't want their 1st round pick because it'll probably be a later one next year. But we will find out in 2 weeks before the draft.
Yeah, it's 2 weeks from today.
2 weeks from today. And
2 weeks from today. It's hard to believe. There's so little hype leading up to this draft because the Saints don't have a 1st round pick or really a 1st day pick. I can't take you seriously in that outfit.
Well, you don't have to.
The Elton John of NFL draft.
I would love to be the Elton John of anything if we're talking seriously.
Keep aspiring. Keep working at it.
I will. Maybe I'll start singing more. But thank you, everyone, for joining us on this week's Dat Chat Live on Facebook. We will be back with you next Thursday to talk more about the draft, and hopefully we'll have a little bit more information about what the Saints might be doing. We'll talk to you soon.